All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to US-Asia Institute's webinar, Rising China, Implications for the US-ROK-Japan Security Alliance. My name is Ellie McCampbell. I'm a current program assistant here at the US-Asia Institute. For those who have attended in the past, welcome back. And for those who are new to the Institute, thank you for joining us today. USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 46-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. Today's webinar is part of our Northeast Asian Focus webinar series, which offers unique insights into US partnerships with Northeast Asian nations through speakers with firsthand knowledge of global power competition and the region. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Keith Luse, the Executive Director of the National Committee on North Korea. Mr. Luse was a senior East Asia Policy Advisor for Chairman and later Ranking Member Senator Richard G. Lugar at the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee from 2003 to 2013. He's participated in several oversight projects and investigations ranging from humanitarian assistance to North Korea to corruption and transparency challenges at the Asia Development Bank and the World Bank. We're grateful to have Mr. Luce participating in today's discussion. I'll turn it over to him to say a few words and introduce our speakers. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we will go over them for Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellie. Welcome to those of you who are participating today. I must say that for me, this is quite a privilege to participate in this US-Asia Institute event, an organization which has meant so much to me through the years. And I'm especially pleased to be with two outstanding experts. These are individuals who have a long and quality track record on matters related to Asia, East Asia, security issues, et cetera, et cetera. Today's briefing, we're exploring US-Korea-Japan Security Alliance and the implications of an increasingly dominant China. And so we have Daniel Sneider. He's a lecturer in East Asia Studies and International Policy at Stanford University. Since 2017, he's been based partly in Tokyo as a visiting researcher at the Cannon Institute for Global Studies, where he works on a diplomatic history of the creation and management of the US Security Alliance with Japan and South Korea during the Cold War. Dr. Terence Roehrig, and by the way, he is also a non-resident distinguished scholar at the Korea Economic Institute. Dr. Terence Roehrig is a lecturer in political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and professor emeritus at the U.S. Naval War College. He was a research fellow at the Kennedy School at Harvard University and a past president of the Association of Korean Political Studies. Both of our guests have written extensively on issues related to Northeast Asia, security matters, et cetera, and each have a much longer biography. We're going to turn first to Professor Sneider for his remarks related to today's topic. Professor?
Thank you. And it's really a great pleasure for me to join the US-Asia Institute. I think they do terrific work, and I'm particularly gratified to be here with Keith and Terry, people I've known for a long time. And I think we've probably talked about these issues many, many times over the years. I have recently written something just looking at the aftermath of the APEC summit meeting, particularly at US-South Korean security relations, but it also touched on the relationship with Japan. And I think it was a particularly interesting moment because it revealed many sort of layers of the security situation in Northeast Asia. So on one hand, we can see, in some sense, almost a return to or a revitalization of Cold War lines of confrontation in Northeast Asia. In a way, I mean, people talk about, is this Cold War 2.0? I don't think the Cold War ever ended, really, in Northeast Asia. But what we see now, I think, is almost an eerie kind of recreation of the moment, if you will, of creation of the Cold War in Northeast Asia, namely the Korean War. I was really struck by the photograph, I've used it in my classes, of Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Kim Jong-un all in a line at the September celebration of the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. And I thought, wow, I mean, it was a moment. If you didn't think about 1950, you were somehow lost. I think you lost the historical sort of reverberation of that. So clearly, on one hand, we see the strategic challenge of that triumvirate there, of that triangle. On the other hand, we've seen, over the last years, and this stretches from the previous administration into now in the US, of the US, South Korea, Japan security cooperation structure, which again, in some sense, had its birth in the Korean War. So uh, it's it was this event in APEC was preceded by or just at the beginning of that event, a meeting between the new Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi Sanai, and the relatively new President of South Korea, Lee Jae-myung. And many people were worried about that meeting, that it would, because of the views that Prime Minister Takaichi has on wartime history and the past. She's a fairly, I'd say, a revisionist conservative in the Japanese pantheon. That we might see a retreat from the kind of cooperation that we saw during the last several years. But instead, there was, I think, a reassertion of that. The two leaders talked about having a future-oriented relationship, a forward-oriented relationship. They sort of skirted around some of the issues of colonial and wartime history, which are still there. They haven't gone away, but they're been sort of somewhat put to the side. At least on the level of officialdom, the Trump administration remains committed to this triangular security cooperation structure that gained momentum, I think, particularly at the Camp David summit during the Biden administration. So we see these two, in some sense, that Cold War confrontation between these two triangles going on. And there was clearly steps to strengthen, to some degree, I think, the bilateral relationship between Japan and the United States and South Korea and the United States, in the form of these meetings that took place, Trump's visit to Tokyo on his way to the APEC summit meeting, and then the meeting between Lee Jae-myung and the president in Gyeongju in Korea. Lots of discussion about security cooperation in areas we haven't seen before, building nuclear-powered submarines, maybe some movement towards the transfer of the wartime operational control of U.S. forces, U.S. and South Korean forces, from the current U.S. commander to a South Korean commander. There's something been under discussion and in process, very slow process, for a long period of time. And even some interesting discussion about altering the civil nuclear agreement between the United States and South Korea that would allow South Korea to engage in things like nuclear fuel reprocessing and so on, which could be potentially sort of create what people call nuclear latency, that is the capability to develop nuclear weapons at some point. So, and the meeting in Tokyo was very warm, and lots of echoes of the Abe style of managing relations between Japan and the United States. And all of that against the backdrop of the trade and investment discussions, which have their own peculiar quality under this administration. So on that level, it looks like we have this kind of tightening of these lines of confrontation. And I would say Takaichi in particular seem to want to go down the road, much more down the road of confrontation with China. Now, having said that, and I want to talk about that aspect in a second, but I think there's another process going on, which is that both Japan and South Korea are engaged in what I've called quiet hedging, hedging against what they see as the process of a change in the way allied relationships are working with the United States, and also a process of sort of offshoring, if you will, a retreat of the United States from its forward defense commitments in the region. And I think it's that quiet hedging that tends to get missed. I think in Washington, people focus on the visible signs of solidarity and security tightening. But underneath that, and if you read, as I do, the Japanese and the Korean media, this discussion is way out in the open. Whether you can rely on the United States as an ally anymore is a vibrant subject of discussion. And the way that it manifests itself is not overt in the sense that there aren't people who are saying, oh, we have to break with the United States. No, the operational policy of our allies is to keep the United States as engaged as possible, to keep us close, to try and prevent the United States from retreating to a kind of hemispheric focus or to a trade war dominated relationship with its allies. So on the surface, they're all about, preserving and strengthening the alliance. But underneath that, they're doing other things. One of the other things they're doing is there's a third triangle operating here, and that's the Japan, China, South Korea triangle, which actually, by the way, is a formal structure that exists. And they have a planned summit meeting coming up. And that structure is all, and I think it's also some ways you can see this in the expansion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement that the Japanese are quietly spearheading, which is also creating bridges between that grouping and Europe. So it ties into Southeast Asia. So trying to create a kind of free trade space that exists separate outside of the United States. So I think you could see that at the APEC meeting in certain ways, and that the Chinese leadership clearly is playing on this. The whole pitch of the Chinese leadership at Xi Jinping was, we're the responsible stewards of the free trade system in some sense, we're the continuers of the post-war order that the Americans have retreated from, if you want to have free flow of people and capital and so on, and peaceful settlement of relations, come to China. And the meeting between Xi Jinping and Lee Jae-myung was very interesting in that while Lee Jae-myung did his best to have a very close, good relationship with Donald Trump, he spent a lot of time with Xi Jinping. They had dinner, they had long talks. The emphasis was heavily on economic cooperation, but not only on that, and cooperation in all sorts of other areas. And the message you got was that the South Korean government is still determined to pursue a kind of dual policy of maintaining its alliance relationship with the United States while it engages the Chinese. And it's very clear if you look at there was a meeting of the Security Consultative Mechanism between the United States and South Korea after the APEC summit. The Koreans have drawn some very clear lines that they don't want to be engaged in, while they accept the idea, this so-called strategic flexibility idea that American forces in Korea might be used for other contingencies. They basically don't want to be drawn into regional conflicts, which means they don't want to be drawn into an anti-China front. And there is a little bit of a tension between that position and the Japanese government. Takaichi, I think her meeting with Xi Jinping was quite cold, remarkably so, and very brief, 30 minutes. And everybody knows 30 minutes in a diplomatic meeting is not a long time. She went through a laundry list of Japanese complaints, restrictions on fish and beef exports, problems in the East China Sea, treatment of Japanese who've been assaulted in China. She even raised issues of Hong Kong and Xinjiang, things that normally Japanese leaders would not, I think, raise directly with the Chinese. And Xi Jinping lectured her about you need to reiterate your commitment to the Murayama statement, the statement that was made in 1995, in which the Japanese Prime Minister apologized and acknowledged Japan's responsibility for colonialism and aggression in Asia. And he did that quite well, knowing that Takaichi, in fact, rejects the Murayama statement. And then subsequently in the Japanese parliament, in the question and answer after her policy statement, she made the statement before APEC, but that diet debate followed that. She's made some rather unusual statements for a Japanese prime minister, sort of retreating from elements of strategic ambiguity about whether Japan would be involved in a Taiwan contingency, as well as talking about. I gather she's opened the door to the idea that the three non-nuclear principles are no longer necessarily sacrosanct. Things that are said in Japan, but not usually, almost never by the prime minister in the parliament. And Chinese have responded in a kind of wolf warrior fashion. And there's an escalation of tensions. And Taiwan is at the center of that. And Takaichi very pointedly, I saw, met with the Taiwanese chief delegate to the APEC summit meeting twice. And she is known to have a very close relationship with the ruling party in Taiwan. And I think that portends a rather different pathway for Japan-China relations, but it also suggests that Japan-South Korea relations may also not move as smoothly as they did after that first meeting. So I'm watching all of that. So we have a lot of things in motion. And I think it's always good to have a view on the ground in the region, because the view from Washington, I'm afraid, tends to be, somewhat distorted by the discussions that go on here. So we just basically labeled everybody. This one's pro-China, this one's anti-China, or whatever it is. It's always much more complex when you get into the region itself. So anyway, I'll stop there, and hopefully we'll have lots of good discussion.
Indeed it is, and thanks for making that very important last point. Dr. Roehrig, please proceed.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the US-Asia Institute for this invitation. Wonderful to be part of this great discussion. I'm going to add a few elaborating points to some great arguments Dan has already laid out, as well as raise a couple of other issues in a bit more depth. But let me start first with saying that China's rise is clearly an important motive behind this example of minilateralism, as it is being called in the Asia-Pacific region. As there are concerns in South Korea and Japan for China's future strategic intent, there are concerns for China pressing some of its maritime claims. Recently, in regards to South Korea, a lot of concern about Chinese activities in the Yellow Sea and three structures that have been built there in violation of one of the agreements that China and South Korea has to be able to manage their overlapping exclusive economic zones in that region. Of course, Japan has the Senkaku's dispute with China and the pressing of China on some of those issues. I think also economically, there's an important element that I often hear from some of my Korean contacts, is that Chinese growth and innovation had for years been a very important opportunity for trade, for investment. But increasingly, while that still is the case, China is increasingly becoming much more of a competitor in certain key sectors. And so that raises some important challenges that help to push Korea, Japan, the United States, and others into more of an economic response. Because when I look at the joint statements that come out from many of these different meetings, I think what is very interesting is, sure, there are the couple of pages that deal with security issues, but then there are many pages that deal with economic and tech cooperation issues. And I think that's a real signal of not only the concern for China going forward, but how the global security environment is changing in a number of ways. But I would also say that it's very important to remember that this trilateral cooperation is not only about China, that you also have North Korea-Russia relations over the last couple of years being a very significant addition to the security environment in a couple of ways. The economic benefits that North Korea has gained from this has certainly taken the pressure off the North Korean economy. Also, there is concern about what kinds of military assistance, military technology collaboration with the North Koreans that may in the future increase North Korea's already very robust military capabilities and how that is moving forward. And lastly, again, the North Korean nuclear and missile threat continues to grow. I think beyond what many would have thought was possible a number of years ago, perhaps 10 or so. And not only modernizing, not only these capabilities, but also North Korea has been sending signals that they are intent on modernizing their conventional capabilities, land forces, but also their Navy. Now, those are tall orders to be able to pull all of that off, even with assistance from Russia. But you put this together, and that's another very important aspect of this trilateral cooperation. And in some respects, going back to what Dan said earlier, there is some difference of opinion in the grouping in regards to China, as noted that South Korea is a bit more willing to try to have a balanced relationship with China. North Korea is one thing all three can agree on, and that this is a very serious security concern and something that helps to push this alliance arrangement. And again, I stress arrangement. It's really more of a coalition of two bilateral alliances to be able to have some staying power. But let me also join Dan in saying, in addition, there is tremendous concern for U.S. continued engagement, the U.S. commitment in both countries. And I think what is interesting that I have heard from some is it's not just about the Trump administration. It is about a possible reflection of a broader sentiment within the United States that may outlast the next 3 years. And that just adds to this uncertainty of where this could go beyond even just these next 3 years. And so, you know, these tariff deals have been costly to Japan and South Korea. You know, there are some assessments that talk about these meetings, you know, I think as Dan said, the optics and other things very successful in building the personal relationships, progress in bringing the tariff rates down. But yet when you really look at the bottom lines, Japan and South Korea paid a big price for all of this. And it really was mitigating what could have been a worse situation. And so these elements add to concern about the alliance and where this could go going forward. But I think the perhaps silver lining of some of that is these agreements, you know, in particular, you see the South Korean shipbuilding agreement, but also some of the other investment agreements between Japan and South Korea. I think I love Dan's term of quiet hedging. This is about how can you bring these three countries together in a way that integrates their economic and their security infrastructure in ways that helps cement the alliance beyond some of the sort of traditional ways that we tend to look at for whether the alliances are strong and whether these things can endure the future. But putting this all together, I think it is important to note that bottom line, the security environment has changed dramatically in the region. And that is the key driver here in a number of different complex and integrated ways. And I think, you know, from the Japanese perspective, that is what is driving some of the changes, evolutionary changes in Japan's defense posture over the last number of years, the willingness to cooperate these sorts of things between Japan and South Korea, again, I think are very important aspects of this. But to add one level of caution, again, while the August 23 Camp David meeting was a great sign and a sort of a heady period of the possibilities for trilateral cooperation, I think there are still reasons that despite all that you hear in regards to forward-looking relationships, that there is still elements of fragility here that need to be carefully managed and that could possibly derail based on the unresolved history issues. And great example just happened this past week where South Korea had on the table a plan that they were going to refuel some of its Blue Eagle fighter jets that were going to be headed to Dubai to refuel at the Naha Air Base in Okinawa. But because these jets flew over Dokdo/Takashima, that got suspended. Now, both governments, I think, are trying to downplay this and go beyond this. But yet I think it's a reminder of how there is some degree of fragility in this relationship. And let me add to this that I think an important element going forward is how leaders in not only South Korea and Japan, but the United States, in its ability to give the sort of strategic space, if you will, for these two countries to work together, that it is important that all three work to institutionalize this arrangement as good as possibly can be. And I think, you saw that clearly in the last meeting between President Yi and Prime Minister Ishiba as he was going out the door, that even with just a short period of time, wanting to have one more meeting to try to stabilize this sort of shuttle diplomacy infrastructure, if you will, signs look good that this will be carried forward. But again, I think it is important that all three members of this trilateral arrangement continue to work to be able to institutionalize this, because there are some clear domestic political hurdles that could derail from any three of these different partners. And that could be a challenge going forward, especially for the long-term staying power of this particular grouping. Let me end with one other last issue that I think is important, that the rise of China raises in regards to the trilateral cooperation. And that is how, as China's military power, political power, economic power has grown, it has put the issue of Taiwan at the forefront more than it had been perhaps a decade or so ago. And a great deal of concern for how China might move against Taiwan in some particular scenario. Now, I think there's an argument to be had that it may not necessarily be overt military action, that it could be much more about economic and political pressure on Taiwan, but that this issue is one that China has clearly laid out as a core interest, and so it is going to be around. The US position, of course, is complicated and has been characterized often as strategic ambiguity. But over the last number of years, I think you have clearly seen a US leaning in the direction of much greater support for Taiwan and perhaps some level of Taiwan de facto independence. Now, of course, every time a leader says that, including President Biden, the State Department is always right in there walking that back and saying, no, no, no. But yet there are signals that indicate otherwise. And I think one of the other interesting ones came in February when the State Department removed from its website its policy position on Taiwan, removed the statement, quotes, "We do not support Taiwan independence." That was pulled, indicating that that was not such a hard line anymore for the United States, perhaps. I say all of this because if there is going to be conflict over Taiwan, South Korea and Japan are going to have some very, very difficult decisions to make. What level of involvement they can do, what level of involvement they feel is in their interest and they wish to do, as well as what level of involvement the United States is going to expect them to do, in the notion of the US has been there as a strong ally. Now is when we need your help. We're going to need you to provide some level of assistance. What is that going to be? That's the big question. And I think there are some very difficult pieces to look at and to answer there. And I think the other piece to this that makes this even more complex is if there is going to be some level of conflict or some crisis, and depending on how that involves, what is the North Korean situation going to be in that regard? Is that going to be something that is going to be exacerbated or seen as a point where North Korea could take advantage of some particular element? How is that going to impact South Korea's willingness to do any sort of elements to support a U.S. operation? Of course, there is the whole issue of strategic flexibility that has been part of the modernization of the alliance discussions that the United States and South Korea have had over the last number of months and years. But also, Japan will have some similar kinds of difficult questions, as demonstrated again by the fallout from the statement from the Prime Minister this week. So in short, let me conclude by saying that there are some difficult issues on the horizon, and the trilateral cooperation is a potential strong point. I mean, I think this is a great coalition that can help to manage some of these very difficult issues coming forward. But it is not an easy proposition, and it is fragile, and there are not full disagreements across the board of all three that are going to make managing that very, very challenging. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Roehrig. Excellent, excellent comments. This is such a complex issue, is it not? When we talk about the US-ROK-Japan Security Alliance. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that our audience today reflects a wide range of understanding on these issues. And I'd like to just pause for a moment. Dan, turn to you. How would you define this alliance? What does that mean? What does that mean in terms of commitments from the United States, for example?
Well, it is an odd structure in the sense that I think Terry sort of said it. It's two bilateral security alliances, which are bound by treaty commitment and bound by extended deterrence guarantees and so on. It isn't a trilateral alliance. It's a structure of trilateral cooperation in some sense. It's a kind of pulling together of these two bilateral alliances. I think it's look, the United States has been trying to get Japan and South Korea to cooperate with each other, frankly, since even before the restoration of sovereignty in Japan. It took the United States, 15 years to pressure the two of them to normalize diplomatic relations. And anybody who studies Japan-Korea relations, which I do, knows, as I think Terry alluded to, this is a very, very fragile relationship. And Americans tend to approach it saying, well, you guys, we have these shared strategic interests, and you should just put this past history stuff to the side. Why don't you, forget about that stuff and focus on, the common threats that we face. And that's been the American approach pretty consistently over a period of time. Frankly, it doesn't, I've written this many, many times. That only works in the very short term because, in fact, these issues of the past are deeply embedded questions of identity, particularly in Korea, but even so in Japan. I mean, frankly, if Americans understood what Takaichi thinks about Japan's wartime and colonial past, they might be a little bit shocked. In her view, these were justified actions. I mean, she's a defender of the rationale of the Japanese Empire, and she's written about it a lot. This is not like casual beliefs on her part. These are deeply held beliefs. She visited Yasukuni Shrine, the shrine to Japan's war dead, which is a very controversial place because it enshrines the souls, if you will, of the convicted Japanese war criminals every year, sometimes more than once a year, when she wasn't prime minister. I feel pretty certain she's going to do it again while she's prime minister. She's basically determined to do that, not right now. And that's going to trigger all sorts of problems. And Americans, response to this that says, well, don't focus on that, doesn't really work. I think that I really am impressed with the Lee Jae-myung government in Seoul. Lee Jae-myung, who's on the left in Korea, is a progressive, has made some very critical remarks. He accused the previous government, the Yoon government, of being pro-Japanese. He's not considered to be a friend of Japan, but he's made a real effort to keep the momentum that Terry mentioned that Ishiba wanted to continue by visiting Korea just before he left the premiership, to keep it going. So there's a commitment there on their part, but it can be disrupted at any time. I don't see any evidence, frankly, that President Trump has any understanding of these things. His relationship to this is through completely different transactional lenses. So I'm not sure the Americans will be much help in this case. So it's really going to be up to the Koreans and the Japanese to work their way through these things. I want to mention one thing, though, which is that, before President met with Xi Jinping, he tweeted out something, or whatever, he truthed out, whatever they call it. This was going to be a meeting of the G2. Well, people in Japan know when that word G2 gets said, it sort of sets off like big alarm bells in Tokyo, because it implies a condominium between the United States and China that, to some degree, makes the relationship with Japan and Korea very secondary, and subordinates it to it. So there is a fear, not only that the U.S. might drag the United States into a conflict, U.S. might drag Japan and Korea into a conflict with Taiwan. There's also the fear that the U.S. is going to abandon Taiwan, make a grand bargain with the Chinese, and leave their allies high and dry. So in a way, the Trump administration is driving the Koreans and the Japanese together in a different way, not for this grand strategic purpose, because they both have to cope with the fear of abandonment and the danger that the United States is going to go off in a direction which undermines their alliance. So there's actually another interesting force that pushes them together.
Thank you. Dr. Roehrig, you have written about the nuclear umbrella, that the U.S. security commitment to both Japan and South Korea includes this nuclear umbrella. For the benefit of our audience, would you please define nuclear umbrella? What does that mean? And under what circumstances or conditions would the United States activate the use of nuclear weapons, or shall we say, implement the umbrella policy?
Sure, and that is a very important question within the alliance, the credibility of the U.S. nuclear umbrella. And it is a commitment, at least depending on how you define this, that the United States would be willing to use nuclear weapons to defend South Korea and or Japan. Now, I think one of the dilemmas or debates, if you will, in regards to this is the United States does not specify specifically, nor would you expect it to, under these conditions, we will use nuclear weapons. This is how we will use them, at least certainly not in a public forum, but even stated U.S. policy is that nuclear weapons is one option of a possible conventional response, ballistic missile defense, as well as economics that are part of the defense commitment. So the nuclear umbrella is one part of the U.S. defense commitment. But South Korea in particular, and I've had this discussion on a number of occasions, would like to see something that is more specifically committing the United States to using nuclear weapons under certain circumstances. And I think, first of all, that's very difficult to be that specific. Even in a classified setting, it all depends. But I also tried to argue that I'm not convinced nuclear response is necessarily the correct response, depending on what the circumstance is. And so it is perhaps another level of strategic ambiguity to say all options are on the table. A nuclear response could be one of those, but it may not necessarily be a guaranteed response depending on what the circumstances are. But again, that may not necessarily always be terribly comforting to some allies, or to some in South Korea, some in Japan, et cetera. But again, I think that is the description of the nuclear umbrella. Now, what you have seen, though, in the South Korean side with the Washington Declaration, and I think you have seen this increasingly on the Japanese side, despite these sorts of ambiguities, if you will, on when nuclear weapons would be used, that there is much more direct conversation planning about when this might be the case, so that there is a greater assurance on the South Korean part, on the Japanese part, that the United States would be willing to use nuclear weapons in certain circumstances. And so it's in some sense pulling the curtain away from the nuclear planning so that there's a better sense among allies of what the United States is doing. But of course, the big debate in South Korea is whether this is enough, and that there is increasing discussion among at least analysts that there is further impetus to move towards at least a latent nuclear program in South Korea. And the nuclear-powered submarine, and let me stress nuclear-powered submarine, does also certainly give another potential launch platform if South Korea did ever decide to acquire nuclear weapons. However, the nuclear sub-program, I mean, the more you read the assessments now, the more you see this is complicated. If you want to bet $20, there's going to be a nuclear submarine in South Korea in the next 10 years. Good luck with that. I think this is going to be a very, very long, complicated process. We shall see where this goes forward in the years ahead.
Thank you. So shifting to another topic, as relates to the rise of China, the word deterrence is often used. References to deterrence. The United States, or the United States along with Japan and Korea, must better coordinate on policies of deterrence related to China. Now, you'll recall in terms of North Korea and deterrence, you know, under the Biden administration and President Yoon Suk-yeol, both governments came out with a policy of deterrence, which included killing the North Korean leader, kill chain, et cetera. It's a very forward-leaning, provocative policy that some would suggest elicited certain responses from North Korea that might or might not have occurred had the, shall we say, the poking to the North Koreans, had that not happened. So for both of you, when it comes to China, when it comes to South Korea, Japan, US, and China, define for me deterrence that you think would be effective, and at what point do our policies or our components of deterrence, at what point do they, in fact, or do they spur China to actions it might not have otherwise taken? In meetings I've had with Chinese diplomats and academics in recent months, they insist that the increased US-ROK-Japan cooperation forces China to respond, right? So they use that. So how do you deal with this in your own mind? And along this topic, how should trilateral alliance leverage its how should the alliance leverage its diplomatic influence to counter or manage the perception of a rising bloc, shall we say, from the West? Dan?
I'm not, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think Chinese policy for a long time was to weaken the American alliance relationships with both South Korea and Japan. There was only a brief period, I think, during the sort of, Kissinger Nixon opening when Kissinger argued to Zhou Enlai that, you should support the US-Japan Security Alliance because it functions as the proverbial cork in the bottle, that we're there to prevent the Japanese from militarizing. And I think that had a certain appeal to the Chinese leadership. But for a long time, I think Chinese have basically sought to drive wedges wherever they could. Certainly in Seoul, they do that, and to some degree in Tokyo as well. So I don't know whether the fact that we've, that there's this tightening of security cooperation is really the cause of Chinese military buildup or threats or so on. I think they're down that path anyway. So it's not so much about what we do. I think it's more about reassuring our allies that we're going to be there. I mean, we began the extended deterrence dialogues with the Japanese and then with the Koreans during the Obama administration, I believe, partly to do what Terry was saying, to give them more explicit understanding of how that nuclear option would be used. I think what I see is an undermining that's going on of that extended deterrence guarantee, which then drives the Japanese and the Koreans both to talk about going nuclear themselves because they no longer feel reassured. I mean, one of the things that happened, and we talk about North Korea, is that during the first Trump administration, Japanese were deathly afraid that Trump was going to make a deal with Kim Jong-un, which would end the long-range missile program of the North Koreans, so end the threat to the continental United States, but leave intact the shorter range and the nuclear arsenals, the warheads that go with it, that threaten Japan and South Korea. So there would be this kind of strategic separation between the United States and its allies. I think that fear is still there. It's there in Tokyo. Trump keeps talking about wanting to sit down with Kim Jong-un. Didn't happen this time. Maybe making a peace declaration in the Korean Peninsula, which then leads potentially to the end of the UN command and maybe to the withdrawal of US forces from South Korea. That's on the minds of Koreans and Japanese a lot. So I think that in some ways they're trying to reinforce the American commitment, the extended deterrence commitment, in part not so much because they see the threat from China, but because they see the threat of withdrawal and retreat from the United States.
All right, Professor Roehrig?
Yeah, I mean, the deterrence piece in regards to Taiwan is the challenging one. I mean, you look at historically, this is a real problem. The status quo is the only arrangement that all sides have been willing to tolerate up to this particular point. But as this status quo perhaps gets pushed, deteriorates on different sides, now it becomes more difficult in regards to, so how do you continue to deter China from moving against Taiwan? Well, they have set it as an absolute core priority for them. But yet there's also an aspect of deterrence that is about assurance not to allies, but assurance to adversaries that if you behave, you aren't still going to get whacked or lose your core interest. And so I think there also has to be careful thought given to how do you deter China, but yet also assure them that you are not really headed down a road towards de facto or in fact deterrent independence in a way that can preserve the status quo until there is some solution to this issue. And I don't have any solution to how you solve this. But I think that is where it's not only about deterring and reassuring allies, it's also about assurances to an adversary that they don't lose their interests if they behave. And so how can China be assured that if it doesn't move against Taiwan, at least the status quo stays in place? But again, these are really, really difficult, complex factors and variables to be able to manage.
Thank you. So I'm now going to turn to questions from the audience. And given the time situation, first question will be for Professor Sneider, and then I will have a second question for Dr. Roehrig. Professor Sneider, Sharissa Wu asks, do you think there's an undercurrent of resentment or frustration over America's dominance in regional affairs? Many in Korea want more autonomy because they feel instrumentalized by Washington-China policy, such as THAAD, semiconductor export controls, etc. How do you think Korea and Japan balance the desire for American military cooperation and security and a feeling of regional sovereignty? And Dan, if you could please respond as briefly as you can.
Yeah, I mean, no question. There is a huge drive for autonomy, particularly if you look at Korean, South Korean defense planning. It's called, Defense 2.0, building capabilities that give them independence from their reliance on the United States. That's going on. The revision of the 123 agreement, I read, as part of that. OPCON transfer is part of that. I think the left in Korea, the progressives, whenever they've been in power, they've pursued this goal pretty forcefully, and I see that happening again. While at the same time, of course, they try and keep the alliance going as best they can. And you can see similar things in Japan. I mean, the discussion about long-range strike capability for Japan is an interesting one because it implies Japanese ability to carry out offensive operations outside of the security alliance. And I know American defense planners who are a little bit worried about that. There's always the problem of we get pulled into a conflict we don't want to be in. So I think that sort of parallel impulses of we need autonomy and we need to sort of hedge against our dependence on the United States, and we need to keep the Americans as engaged and as close as possible. That's a dynamic that's been going on for a long time, and it's going on forcefully now. I will say on the Taiwan question, the discussion I heard a lot of in Tokyo, a little bit in Seoul as well, is that they're worried that Trump is going to abandon Taiwan. They're worried that he was going to go into the meeting with Xi Jinping in APEC and trade Taiwan for some, I don't know, whatever bauble of a trade agreement he was pursuing. So, the Taiwan question is also a little bit complicated. It isn't just, are we going to get drawn into a conflict with China? It's the Americans are going to, just leave us high and dry again.
Thank you. So Dr. Roehrig, a final question. Juri Sekaguchi asks, Japan's defense buildup has accelerated, including counterstrike capabilities. How aligned are Tokyo's intentions with U.S. expectations, and where do you anticipate friction emerging?
Interesting question. I think that I think that this is part of a expected evolution of Japanese defense posture. And I think that it has been slow and certainly moving in important directions, I think, in that regard. I think that as far as friction goes, and you saw in the summit meetings at APEC, at least under the current administration, it was a lot more about economics than it was about security issues. And so I think that there has, again, as Dan has said very well, that this kind of integration among the different economies is part of this hedging to be able to keep the United States somewhat involved in such in case there is some differences in regards to the security issues. But I think very clearly, you know, Japan plays an important role in US security planning in the Asia Pacific. And I think that that helps to ameliorate some of the potential for friction in the alliance. But I think that Taiwan would certainly be one of those issues if that accelerates in some particular way. Also, in regards to dealing with North Korea, again, some of the differences between the current administration and Japan and South Korea on some North Korean issues, a separate missile deal, a separate peace deal, those things would all be greatly concerning to Japan as well.
And on the topic of Japan and the United States, I'm continually fascinated by the intermittent discussions through the years between Japan and North Korea, some of which have been more publicly known, some of which have been quietly conducted, shall we say. And that brings up an entirely different dynamic to this discussion. We won't go there. I apologize to those of you who have submitted questions. We were not able to get to you. But again, I want to thank Professor Sneider and Dr. Roehrig for being with us today. Ellie, back to you.
Thank you so much, Keith, for moderating. And I'd also like to thank Professor Sneider and Professor Roehrig for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for this webinar. While we are out of time, if you would like to follow up, please reach out and we can see if we can connect you to our speakers. The video will also be posted on our YouTube. And thank you again for joining us today and have a great day. Thank you,
Thank you
everyone.
very much.
Thank you very much.